Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Gnostic Media's podcast, UnSpun, episode number 90. I had to stop and think about that. Number 90, sheesh, the numbers go fast. What is it, like 267 on the Gnostic Media shows and 90 number on 90? I had to stop and think about that. And just like last week, I forgot to mute the damn browser again. You know, it's I gotta... Duh.
More fat in your coffee.
More fat in my coffee, exactly. So, let's see. Well, I wanted to start off, mention donations. Thanks to everyone who donated. Also, a special thanks, and I think I left his letter in the other room. I was just looking for it. But thanks to Kane for his donation, and Kane is going to be turning 7 in a couple of weeks. And... So he wanted to mention that, so I shouldn't be saying that he's 6 anymore because, pretty soon he'll be 7. Also, what is it going to be next week? Yeah, basically it's going to be next week for the 24th. Maybe the week after, it depends, is actually the 9-year anniversary of the show, or of the Gnostic, of doing the podcast, right? And so that'll mark 8 years since we released the Trivium with Gino Denning, which was October 29th or 31st, so 30th right in there of 2009.
Wow.
So it's been a long time and learned a heck of a lot. It's been a great journey. I mean, there's probably no better way to learn so much.
Yeah.
But anyway... Thanks, everybody, for the support and the donations. Thanks, Bill, for coming on. Today we're going to be talking about operational epistemology.
Yeah, it's time to ramp up the Trivium, I think, anyways. And when I first introduced this idea to you, we began with talking about the Trivium. And then I think something that gets lost on people that are learning it on their own is that notion of corkscrewing through.
Yeah, you know what? And... hold that thought, because as you were saying that, I was just looking for my corkscrew images that somebody was helping me design a couple years ago, so I've got them, and I want to show them on screen here.
Okay.
So, and this has been a concept that we were trying to implement in a visual sense, and I'll just put it over me since you're better to look at than I am. And so here's this corkscrew concept. Now, we had a couple of these, and I've forgotten who was helping me make these, but, so basically, when you get into the Trivium, there's this whole notion that there's a process that whenever you hit a contradiction, you essentially go back into... Here, let me just find the... and this, and Bill, you probably can't see these, but... this idea of this corkscrew. Now, this one is just kind of like the one I'm showing on screen is like a wine corkscrew, and it just like a knob on the top digging down, but that doesn't really describe it quite right. Shoot, I just moved the silly thing. And here's another version that we were working on, but the idea, and you can see grammar, logic, rhetoric, and it's, as it's corkscrewing down into the topic. And this is something that operationally...
Well, and this is what I was getting at, is that by corkscrewing through, we're going into more nuanced layers of understanding, which you will get an operational understanding by doing that.
Absolutely.
I think the issue is that it's an implicit skill that you're doing. You're not directly addressing.
Right. So what we need to do is try to figure out a way to move it over into the explicit so that it becomes part of the study, so that, like people like you and I that have been looking at it for years, it's just kind of obvious that that's what you need to do. But I think it's lost.
Yeah, and I think what happens is
people.
Yeah, and I think what happens is that you'll bump into more sophisticated arguments that if you don't have the time to go through that corkscrewing, you won't catch the fallacies. Right. So this will come up quite often where you'll have arguments that appear to have a good set of grammar, good evidence underneath it, that relies heavily on a rational argument, and you won't catch that they're using the logic to reframe the grammar. So this happens in postmodern argumentation a lot of the times, that the weight of their argument is only on internal consistency. Quite often that's not even there. so what I wanted to bring up, and this, so I'm drawing off of predominantly Gary Edwards, who's a professor in philosophy of science, and of course Kurt Doolittle again, and the idea of having more criteria than just the three: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So the explicitly introducing the notions like falsifiability from Popper, that what you're asserting as a theory or as an explanation, if there's no possible way to falsify it, then it's pseudoscience. That's the delineation between science and pseudoscience. Go ahead.
Now, I do want to make a point here for the audience that these are ideas that Gene did express to me, in the, when I was learning the Trivium with him, and about epistemology and aesthetics and these other, philosophies coming on top actually after you got a firm grasp of the Trivium and the Quadrivium. Uh-huh. So these are not topics that were left out. It was just focused on the Trivium to give the people that first because they missed or lacked those foundational elements.
Yeah, and I think it's critically important to begin with the Trivium. Because if you had begun with a rationalist or idealist slant in the philosophy, that takes you down a whole other road.
Right.
So the Trivium,
and the Trivium is what people have to realize is that the Trivium is what was taught in elementary school. Okay. Mm-hmm. So it was not your higher level education. This was, in fact, your foundational elementary learning, and then that was all pushed out and eliminated. So because it was eliminated for the last century, we basically just had to pour it out back to the adults, and because they didn't have that foundation at all.
Mm-hmm. And if you begin with that, then it gives you a good solid rooting in the notion that anything that you're asserting has to be rooted back in some sort of precept, some sort of perception or observation out in the world. So it has to originate in the commons, what we were saying, in the informational commons. And from the Trivium, I found Peikoff's lectures in objectivism is a good way of taking the Trivium and moving it into more nuance and adding a little bit more awareness around some of the normal arguments against Aristotelian philosophies. But even then, those first two steps won't be enough. There's a lot of really complicated, nuanced arguments that spin out, that sort of attack the notion of existence as the axiom that we work from, that it becomes harder and harder to argue against. And really you're left without the argumentation. You're left there going, well, I just kind of prefer it this way, as opposed to really why do we start with existence as it exists as our axiom? So why don't we start there? Our axiom, existence exists, because a lot of philosophical systems have different axioms as their starting point.
Well, and here's the thing is, and I had David Harriman on the show years ago covering quantum physics and this issue exactly. And this is one of the axioms that you need, that existence exists, because you can't even argue any point without that first premise.
Right. Now, so do you remember Aristotle's three qualities of existence? Existence exists, so there's identity, there's non-contradiction. What's the third one again?
I think I have it up on the website. I'd have to go back and check it.
But I can't remember it at the time. But let's look at existence and say, what's the flaw with the axiom? Because for the most part, what an axiom is what we agree not to argue on. If you're going to debate or converse with somebody, it's just what is the shared common ground. Same as maxims if you're talking about ethics. But in terms of cognition, it's not enough to just say, this is something I'm not going to question. And the notion of existence exists. There's arguments about it being tautological and stuff, which is a separate issue, is we need to have definitions on what existence is. So we have to start there. What is existence? And so the first thing that I posit is, if something is out there in the universe, and it has no effect on anything else in the universe. It casts no light, it has no gravity, things pass directly through it. Can you actually say it exists? And if so, how would you know it exists? If there's no interaction between that object or that existent with the rest of existence, can you even claim that it's there? Right. Because a lot of the stuff in our argumentation is like that. So the first thing that we have to get is that for something to exist means that it has to have an effect. There has to be a consequence of its presence. If there is no consequence to its presence, there's no way for us to even detect that it's there. So that's the first thing, is that existence is to exist in relationship to everything else. And that relationship is causal, in that it can be affected by other things and it can cause effects in other things. So the first premise there is that existence is really about these causal relationships. So we know an object exists by the effects that it has on the rest of the universe. Okay, so that's the first notion there. Now, effects occur within limits. Under certain conditions, the effect will be there. When the conditions change, the effect stops. So that gives us limits to those causal relationships. Those limits define the boundary of the object. That's what gives us the definition of that object. Okay, so now when we say existence exists, what we're really saying is that there is a set of effects that are predictably or constantly there. They're constant causal relations that exist within these limits. Okay, so are you with me there?
Yep.
Okay, so when we're looking at grammar, it's not so much just saying that's there, here's its name, that's part of my grammar. You have to say that's there because of this set of effects that it has, and those set of effects only exist within these limits. Okay, so part of the grammar now is about relationships between the objects. Well, what does that cinch up? That starts to cinch up our logic, because logic is about the interactions as well as our argumentation. It's about the interactions between those objects. Is it consistent, internally consistent? So if we look at and begin with an operational standpoint, a functional standpoint on how something exists, and it exists within a causal context, it starts to inform all of these other areas of our cognition or how we understand something. Okay, so let me go back to my notes here, because it's a lot to cover, because I think I told you earlier it could be like 8 shows to get through something like this, right? Okay, so our grammar is really about identity. So what I'm saying that identity is existing within these causal relationships. Then when we say that we can observe that object out there, or that there's evidence out there in the universe for that thing, what we're really saying is that it's observable, that we can measure it. Measurement is now what we're talking about when we're talking about the measurement of the observation. We're specifically describing the effect that object has that's defining its existence. So when we talk about that, now we're talking about correspondence. Does my observation correspond with the object in reality? Okay. So correspondence theory, grammar has to have evidence behind it. So that's where our correspondence comes in. Then when we talk about it and communicate it, it has to be without contradiction, right? So this is our internal consistency. There can't be fallacies within our arguments and so on. But just because our arguments don't have incorrect, invalid, or unsound foundations, still is not a guarantee that it's actually real. How we get a guarantee?
You can use false grammar to make a logical argument, essentially, and prove it correct.
Yeah, so if your premises can be false and then your logic can be sound and it's still wrong. So that's to say that it's not what is it? It's not valid, but it is sound, the argumentation sound, or vice versa. But you can also have sound grammar. So you can have all the evidence there. You can have proper premises. And you can have internally consistent logic and still be wrong. So now what are we talking about? Like, well, what the hell are we putting all this effort in? The notion that our observations, correspondence, and the identity of the object has to do with how its causal relations in the world, how it functions in the world, now informs our logic and our grammar. It's what glues those two things together. That why our grammar fits our logic is those causal relationships. It's how it operates in the world. So the operationalism cinches up identity, helps us define identity by helping us find limits on in the boundary conditions of what that identity is. It helps us connect our internal consistent logic to the object directly in a way that's observable, right? So you see what I'm saying is it's starting to fill in the gaps, right? And when we corkscrew through with the Trivium, we would fill in those gaps by iterating through. You hit a contradiction, then you have to go back to the grammar. You find that there was something wrong in how you were identifying it. You know what I'm talking about. So what I'm getting at now is now that we can explicitly talk about a consistency of identity, and we can talk about correspondence to observation. We can talk about functional or operational consistency, which then ties those things together. And then from there, we can begin to test it. So Popper's notion of falsifiability, which states if a hypothesis can't possibly be tested to be false, then it's pseudoscience, it's not science. And really what it's saying is that if the identity that you have around that object is so malleable, it can be applied all over the place, then it doesn't really have an identity.
It's a common problem that we see in just this notion is something like quantum physics.
Yeah.
Where you have...
Or oppression theory as well is another one that's like that.
And with QP, there are actually no two professors who agree on what it is.
And the same thing happens with postmodern theory. Ask somebody to define postmodernism, and it's whatever you want it to be.
Right. So the problem is if every single professor out there, whether it's a Mick Goswami saying it's the merger of science and religion and all of this stuff, or, Brian Greene or any of these other guys, none of them agree. None of them can explain it. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, right at its foundational core, you have all of these contradictions, and it's the sole design of it. The purpose of it, in my opinion, is to get people to believe that if mathematically they can show that anything is possible anytime, at any place, mm-hmm. then therefore the math is the territory and you can't know anything, so appeal to our authority to tell you what to think.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree, and this comes all over, and this is actually a lot of the grounding for Eastern mysticism is this same notion, is very malleable definitions, and then a lot of ad hoc logic behind it to mask in the causal relation. So all these observations that correlate from eating meat and drinking alcohol to being angry. Being too much warm chi in your body. Well, they invent this notion of energy to create the causal connection between what is a correlation and observation, which gets into the next point, is that we can have a theory that provides us a high degree of explanation and a high degree of predictability and zero understanding. And when you're bumping into these kind of arguments that seem like they can be applied everywhere, it has nothing to do with how foundational or how fundamental that theory is. It has to do with how applicable the logic is, that the logic can be applied anywhere. So you're not dealing with an explanation, you're dealing with an interpretation. So we can frame every relationship between humans as an oppressor and the oppressed. If I can identify the oppressor and the oppressed, then I can interpret that relationship from that framework. And then I can do that oppressor-oppressed based on gender differences or racial differences or class differences or geolocation differences or age differences. It's not the predictability and the explanation that theory affords you doesn't verify or give any support to its validity or its reality.
It becomes liberal lip service, essentially.
Yeah, and we deal with these interpretive frameworks all the way. And that's exactly what leads into ideological thought, because ideologies are just oversimplistic interpretive frameworks that allow us to quickly process all this information. But the reason why they have the high applicability is that they may have a solid internal consistency, but there's little identity behind it. So the notion of being able to falsify your theory is about finding the limits within those causal relationships. And when we have those clear limits on those causal relationships, we have clear identity, right? So that means that our explanations, they have to be flexible enough to operate wherever those causal relationships are, but not so flexible that they're meaningless, right? So it's this efficient flexibility in our explanations. Okay? Which leads into the next thing, which is necessary and sufficient, or parsimony. That operational connections that help us give us limits, help us identify how things are operating within those limits, also inform what evidence is necessary to support the argument and what's sufficient. Because we should only have what's sufficient, and only what's necessary. Because the other way that a lot of these more complicated arguments operate, they'll have an interpretive framework, then they apply it all over the place, and they say, look at the mountains of evidence I have for my theory. It's everywhere. And the vast majority of that evidence is it might have some sort of relationship in it somewhere, might have one causal link, but isn't sufficient to explain the whole causal limit, all the causal relationships within the limit. So you can bring it up a whole bunch of irrelevant data to say that it supports your theory, when really all you're doing is overloading it. You're making it so difficult for somebody to go through your evidence that they're just like, oh, he must be right, or they have to go through line by line.
Well,
it's cherry picking.
Exactly.
Right? And then the other side is cherry picking, where they ignore counterfactuals.
What you get, though, but before we go to cherry picking, what you get are these people who, I probably shouldn't mention names, but they're pretty rampant in the so-called alt media thing. But you get these people that will present these massive theories of stuff, and then they overwhelm people.
Yep.
And people become so overwhelmed, they think, well, gee, that guy is so smart, it must be correct.
Yeah, where there's so much evidence, it must be real. And then just adopt what they say without checking any deeper.
Exactly.
So the other side of parsimony is the cherry picking argument, is that if there isn't enough, it's not sufficient to support the argument. They only cherry pick and have the one or two examples that fit their theory, but it doesn't account for that whole realm of causal relations within those limits. So you see, again, on operational epistemology, it informs parsimony, it informs falsifiability, it informs our internal logic and makes sure that that's connected back to our grammar. And our grammar comes out of operational observations. It gives us the effects and the limits of those effects, or the identity of the object. So operational epistemology glues these things together. And then instead of just saying, I have evidence for my claim and I have no fallacious statements, I must be correct. Now you have to go through and say, okay, I've got all my evidence there. I'm internally correct. Am I causally consistent? Are the operational relations there? Are the operational relations relevant to the identity? Do they inform the identity of my grammar? The operational connections consistent with my logic? Are the operational connections falsifiable? Can I test them? And when I do test them, is my evidence necessary and sufficient? So now we're essentially coming up with 5 or 6 different criteria in which we establish what is true, that we're correct, and that we're not lying to ourselves on something. Okay? Now I'm throwing out terms, operationalism and stuff like that, and I should give a little bit of history behind it. I didn't write down the guy's name that came up with E prime. So I'm going to talk about E prime right now, which ties right back into our axiom. The verb to be, that something is, anytime we use the word is, all we're doing is declaring that something holds membership to existence. All we're saying is that something exists. This pen is in my hand. It's just an assertion that that is in existence. And what we can do with that verb is we can hide behind it. We can ramble through a whole bunch of evidence and logic, and then just proclaim, therefore it is this way. And the idea behind E prime is to not use the verb to be when you're writing or trying to think your way through. Now, to some extent, sometimes when I'm debating online, I'll do that. I'll use E prime. But for the most part, what I use it for is to clarify my own thinking. Because if you start writing out something that you understand and working out the problem and thinking it through, and every time you use is, and you can't use is, what you're forced to do is replace is with the operational connections. It forces you to move into the operational or how the object actually exists in reality, right? So it's no longer a point of just saying A is A. It's A because of this and due to that and because of this effect that's observable is therefore A. It forces you to explain and bring forward how it actually exists rather than just saying it exists. Okay? So E prime becomes a really, really sort of foundational tool on developing sort of an awareness and a way of thinking operationally, right? Okay. What are your thoughts so far?
Somebody in the chat room just mentioned that they learned about E prime from Robert Anton Wilson. I do want to say that Robert Anton Wilson was one of the key CIA agents behind the development of neurolinguistic programming, and he sold a lot of hyperbole and mysticism and stuff. But these guys were misusing the application, and
E prime's roots are dubious. I can't remember the guy's name, Krasinski or something like that, and it's far older than these guys. We're talking late 30s, early 40s, and so the notion then is that it was the idea that truth is relative, right? It's relative to the observer. So this is an effect that quantum mechanics had socially. It's starting to trickle out and say that reality is based on your point of perception. That the notion then was to replace is with whatever your observation is. So you don't say the car is driving down the street. You say I see a vehicle, moving right to left in front of me that's parallel with the roadway. So that was their notion, is to always drive back their speech to what they're observing. And this becomes part of the foundation for that truth is relative and ethics is relative and so on. And then it goes into post-structuralism and then eventually into all of the nonsense we see with weaponized anthropology and so on. But I want to couple E prime with another concept, because I'm not talking about just replacing.
Is it Alfred Korzybski?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think the one that really pushed it or refined it was one of his students. Okay. The other notion I want to bring up, and this comes from Brigman, who was a physicist around the same time, 30s through 50s, that said that we wouldn't have had such a shock with quantum physics if we defined our concepts by how we measure them. So this is where the term operational comes in, and specifically what Brigman is talking about when he says an operation is the sequence of actions you take to measure an object. And what he was getting at was that, for instance, say the length of a table, when we say length or the distance from end to end, is a very different concept than when you're talking about the distance between stars in space. That we think about everything in human scale only. And when we start moving into the very small or very large, we superimpose our intuitions on human scale onto these larger scales that may or may not be applicable, and that could be getting in the way of our advancement in sciences. So what he was saying is that distance, say of a kitchen table, that concept of distance should be defined by the way that we measure it. So you stretch out something with incremental marks from end to end, you count the incremental marks, and that's distance at human scale. But then distance at interstellar scales is take the speed of light and divide it by the time the light takes to travel. It's that concept now is relevant or reliant on time, not just distance. But we think of distance only in human scale. So what he was introducing is this idea of rethinking scientific concepts by the operations that we take to observe them. And what I'm getting at is taking the E prime, the is, and taking the notion of observations being tightly coupled, their definitions being tightly coupled, or our definitions of concepts being tightly coupled with our observations, and put that into E prime. And then what we get is a linguistic mode of clarifying thinking, because thinking and linguistics are tightly coupled, that is firmly rooted in reality, in perception, and in existence. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yep.
You're looking suspicious?
No.
Okay. Okay, so I've covered off those two guys. Okay. Now, when we do this, when we have a solid eye on the identity being tightly coupled with our observations, what then comes up is clearer identity really has to do with clearer measurement. So how are we measuring something? And an observation even a sensory observation is really just another mode of measurement. And once we can identify a mode of measurement, then that gives us greater clarity on how that identity relates to all the relative objects and how that identity ties back in with its causal framework. And then from there, then we look at commensurability. And commensurability is just a means of measure across different things. So area, when we calculate area of, say, or volume is better. If, say, we calculate the volume of a sphere and you calculate the volume of a cube, volume is a commensurable measure that lets us compare these two very different shapes. So that's the notion of creating commensurability or looking for commensurability when we're, and measurement when we're building our understanding of something. And if you can identify how you're measuring this, and if you can find commensurability around that measure, then what happens is you're moving away from argumentation. First, we start off with argumentation, then we move into explanation. Now we move out of explanation into building an actual model. We're actually modeling reality now, so that when we speak that argument from an operational standpoint, people can recognize what we're saying in totality, because we're building essentially a verbal model that represents what's happening in the world. And they have the complete model there to then use with their own observations across it. Because you're including the measurement, you're including the identity, you're including the causal relations, you're including the whole packet, right? Because for the most part, and if you dive into a lot of the history of philosophy and the arguments that go on back and forth, most of philosophy is really having a preference of some sort, and the argumentation is really justifications for why it's preferable. And then when you dig a little bit deeper, then you realize that most arguments, especially in the political sphere, are rested on an intuitive morality. So then we say, well, liberty is good. We should all have liberty. And then you say, well, why? And say, well, because of God. Then we're giving a religious moral argument for liberty. Or anarchists will say, well, if everybody just didn't aggress against everybody else, then anarchy could work. Well, that's an ideal based on a moral presupposition that not aggressing against people is a positive thing, as opposed to an operational explanation that says this is exactly how our anarchy would work. And then you find out that it can't, because you're not going to have a consistent or universal morality within a population of people, right? So this is really where the power comes out, to not only in detecting really nuanced layers of bullshit, but really putting like a bulletproof armor around your understanding, and being able to explain things to people that cuts right through the bullshit. So I don't know if some people have been following me on Facebook. Every now and then I'll be able to write something that's well argued, and it's like cuts right to the chase. I can't remember, was it Mark had said something? It was about volunteerism agency and mandatory militia service, and said you can't say that mandatory militia service, it protects liberty, because mandatory is not voluntary, and not voluntary is against liberty. And I just came out and I said, it's because militia doesn't protect liberty, it protects the conditions for liberty to exist, which is sovereignty. And then so that when you can be able to draw the connection to say sovereignty is necessary for liberty to exist, then you can see how mandatory militia service now supports sovereignty, which then protects liberty. It cuts right through, and when people read it, they're like, oh yeah, okay, didn't think of that. And they've got it. But they've got it because you've done the due diligence, right? It's not just that you beat them out with eloquence or whatever else. You've given a clear description that people can recognize when they hear it. And that's the end goal. Okay? All right.
Agreed.
Okay, so I'm going to just recap quickly that there's a number of criteria of consistency that we're trying to measure against. So that's identity, right? Do we have clear identity object? Does it correspond with reality? So is it in reality? Are we internally consistent, meaning no contradictions, no fallacious statements? Is it falsifiable? Is it parsimonious? And is it existentially consistent? And existentially consistent is to say, does it include an operational explanation? Okay. So now we have 6 criteria, right? Most academics are down at 2 or 3. And if they're idealist or rationalist, it's only internal consistency. Okay. So now we're up around here. So when we have this kind of depth to our tool, we don't have to rely on the information given to us by experts anymore. We truly don't. We don't have to rebuild their knowledge anymore. You can hear what they say and go, yes, yes, no, 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 no. The guy's full of shit. Now
Exactly.
go to the next one, right? Yes, yes, no, no. Okay, yes, no, right? And quite often what you can do is somebody will be arguing nonsense, but there'll be a thread of operationalism in it. You can pick that out and not only show them how their conclusion is wrong, but actually correct it and say, this is what you're actually talking about. You're talking about the active agent within a group of people, right? It's not some linguistic, mumbo jumbo being the core of reality, right?
Right.
Okay. All right. So we covered off the criteria. I'm going to go through lots of stuff tonight. The next thing is operationally, what is true? When we talk about truth, how do we find truth in reality? Is truth in reality? What's falsehood? Where does it exist? How does it exist? What's the operational explanation of true? And what's the operational explanation of false?
Well, what we rely on is contradictions versus no contradictions.
Right. And now we have all of these other criteria as well. Right?
Because, you can look at nature and say, okay.
But is the contradiction in nature?
Is the contradiction, right.
We don't find the contradiction in nature.
And so therefore that gives us an axiom that we can build from, because there are no contradictions in nature.
So if there are no contradictions in nature, so there's nothing false in nature, then how can we have true false existing in nature?
Because it's not existing in nature, it's existing in our thoughts.
In our thoughts, or what we assert. So truth is not a property of nature. It's a property of cognition and of sentences that we speak.
And being, it's not in nature, but it's coinciding and consistent with nature.
Well, I would even say that it's not coincident or anything else. The only time truth ever becomes relevant is when we make an assertion about nature. When we make an assertion about reality,
and what is true
becomes relevant.
And what is true?
And is that statement true or not? So true only comes up when we make an assertion about nature. Okay, that means that true is a property of that statement. It's not a property of nature. Nature just is, and nature is never false. We can only be false in our apprehension of nature and in our assertions of nature.
Right.
So true and truth, the search for truth, has nothing to do with nature. It has everything to do with what we're doing with our head and what we're doing with our tongues. Okay?
Correct.
So this is the notion the notion of like correspondence theories of truth is that whatever you're asserting must match with reality, right? And you have to find some correspondence in reality to what you're saying. But then there's a bazillion things that we can do and say that have no correspondence to reality that could or couldn't be true. Like, for instance, I will make coffee tomorrow morning. Nothing in what I said just now corresponds to reality right now. And it won't correspond to reality until tomorrow morning.
Right.
Right? And then we also have contingent phenomena that are not directly apprehensible. So this would be social phenomena or, so on, that don't rely on correspondence, but rely on cohesion. So cohesion to principles. And then people that hold correspondence will bicker with people that hold cohesion. So cohesion is that it coheres to a certain principle, usually utility. So rationalists that don't want correspondence for reality, want to shun science and get rid of epistemology, will tend to say that their criteria for truth is whether it coheres without contradiction to a particular principle, right? And then they argue back and forth.
And argue across domains.
Argue across domains and speak past each other and then never be able to agree on an axiom.
That's an inside joke between Bill and I that probably no one else will get.
Yeah. So what I'm asserting is called the semantic axiom theory of truth. That it's the semantic theory of truth. That truth is a property of thinking and speaking, not of the world. Right? So when we're talking about a pursuit of truth, we're talking about a perfection of our own thinking and speaking. It's about us, not the world.
Correct. And that's a great way to put it. It's about, perfecting our own way of thinking and speaking.
Yeah,
truth.
in our own arguments and everything else. And then with the idea of a semantic axiom of truth, that truth is a semantic axiom, and it just means that it's a property of declarative sentences, like a sentence, blah, is not something you can test for true or false. But if I assert that there's a pen in the desk, that's something that I can test for true or false. So falsifiability is coming.
I don't believe you.
Well, and it's right here. So,
but it wasn't on your desk; it was in your hand. See?
Well, no, it's on a piece of paper, so no, it wasn't on the desk. So, yeah. So the notion now is that truth and falsehood is about the testability of a statement. Have you met the criteria of being true or not? Which now, this cinches up cohesion and correspondence theories of truth, because on some domains of complexity, correspondence is perfectly applicable. That when we talk about physical objects or human scale observability, correspondence is nearly perfect in terms of establishing a true statement. We can observe it, we can test it out in the world. But then there's phenomena, especially things like emergent phenomena or complex systems where there isn't a linear causal relation. It's a concurrent causal relation that you cannot necessarily draw a direct correspondence to. All you can draw is a range, the limits again, a range of probability of a phenomena occurring that coheres to a certain principle. So now we're talking about across scales again, that at one scale or one set of domain, correspondence theory holds true. We can use that as a criteria to establish truth. In other areas, we can use cohesion theory to establish what is true. So morality and ethics, for instance, is something that we can use a coherence theory of truth on. And then in my own thinking is that we begin with correspondence theory and then we move into domains of coherence theory. But in both cases, all those two theories are talking about is by what criteria do we establish whether the statement's true or not. So at the end of the day, truth is a quality of speech and thought. And these other things are just the criteria by which we establish if something is true or not. Okay, so we covered
true.
True so far. And then that brings up the next notion is that truth is provisional, is that given all of the data and everything that I have today, I can make a true statement that is true, that can be updated in the face of new evidence later. Okay.
Correct.
Because this is another
this
downfall.
Goes back exactly to the corkscrew.
The corkscrew, yeah.
Right.
And new evidence comes up, then you bring out the corkscrew and you drive back down again.
Right, and then you verify it, compare it, look for inconsistencies in your previous thinking and previous analysis, and usually it either fits right in or coincides, or you can find.
Or you're defining a new set of limitations. You're hitting a boundary layer.
Or it's a contradiction, and you go in, you immediately find it false, and you toss it.
Right. Or you find that there are two different causal relations coming up that appear to be the same object that aren't. So they appear to be a contradiction until you can understand what's causing the effect.
And in fact, we see this constantly studying natural law from different directions. When what we think starts out with a contradiction, when we get further up, we're all looking at the same thing from different directions, and then we can say, aha, we're all looking at this in the commons from different sides of the commons table or whatever, you know.
Yeah. So for instance, I may not want to put any or rest any credibility on the Bible or history because those are two things that I can't verify for myself, where you might. But we can both have an operational understandings of the principles and concepts in the Bible or in nature and see how they align from it. And so operationally, we can establish the truth of it.
And I do want to have Clint on with you in the next week or two to go into exactly this. And why you're bringing this up is because of Clint's work. And I've been going through, in fact, I've got a couple copies sitting here, but going through, and all of these book flags, there's several hundred of them there, are just natural law and adversarial applications within the Bible. So it's like, it's confirming what Clint has been saying and putting it aside as looking at it from a religious aspect, but going at it strictly from truth and natural law perspective.
Yeah. And then I'm coming at natural law from a different standpoint, that being operational explanations, which coupled with the Bible and then coupled with the effects that it's had on civilizations that allowed institutions to spring up, that allowed those societies to
that enables us to go back in and see where post-Gospels especially, they went in and stuck in little things that allowed for these institutional things to arise and to distort it, So it's like and it's all feeding. And that was a surprise for all of us, really, I think, is that, we had all put the Bible over here, but when you go in and you look at it in terms of natural law and this, it becomes, I hate to say it, self-evident, right?
Mm-hmm. And that's self-evidence again, is what I'm trying to get at, is that if you move out of argumentation and out of explanation and into providing a model, now we're modeling reality, what you're giving is something that not that somebody understands, it's something that they recognize when they hear it, right? It's self-evident when you say it. It aligns with their perceptions or not. And then they may not have all of those observations, but it gives them the unit of measure, it gives them the identity, it gives them the place to look to be able to rebuild it for themselves, right? So then it becomes undeniable. If it's demonstrated, it becomes undeniable. Okay, so did I lose track here? Oh, yes. So I was talking about orders of domain, domain of complexity, coherence and correspondence and so on. There's one last criteria that I would say that it's particular to human interaction that we need to account for. So when we're talking about sociology or ethics or politics, the last criteria of consistency we're looking for is morality. And then having a good foundation through the rest of the criteria of what is the foundation for ethics and morality. Then when you start looking at social systems, you can start saying, does it meet this criteria? And that criteria being a perfect reciprocal exchange of agency between people is the only moral circumstance. If there's any imbalance between that exchange, that's where we find immoral acts. That's where we start going, that's not right. So you can hear somebody argue for a political system or hear somebody argue for a social change or a mode of cooperating. And if it doesn't meet that moral consistency, that reciprocity, you can hit it exactly for what it is. You are stealing the efforts or property from somebody else here, right? And the reason why I bring this up is because when you have that criteria in place and you start looking at human behavior, whether that's political parties, elites, protesters up the street, it becomes apparent that almost always they're arguing for a preference. And as they move up that pecking order, academics just have better arguments for their preference. And what those preferences are some sort of survival strategy. And those strategies can be predatory, parasitical, or symbiotic, right? And we're always looking for the symbiotic relationship. Okay. Flip my page over. That was page 1.
And that was, just to reframe that's communism, conservatism, and liberalism.
Yeah, but even within each of those, you'll find the same thing pop up. Conservatives will argue for a strict meritocracy because that's where they can beat everybody else out. And then that imposes an opportunity cost on the rest of society that we all talk about. We talk about them screwing us over and doing this and doing that. So then you can move into the nuances and say within conservative thought, here's where they're trying to game the system. Within libertarians, here's where they're trying to game the system, and so on. And you can start to pull, you can blow the dross from the water. You can find the value and start discarding the scams, right? Because a lot of the stuff, especially what we're sold on the conspiracy side, which is essentially just a really healthy skepticism of social systems, which I think is necessary. A lot of what the conclusions we come to, we're throwing the good stuff out with the bad quite often, and we have to be careful of that because it does prevent us from being more effective in social change. Okay. So I've been alluding to argumentation, explanation, or modeling. And when we talk about generally unfalsifiable theories, we call pseudoscience. Generally at that point of argumentation, people are arguing for what can be imagined. It's if you give them not a model in reality, but you give them causal connections or definitions that they can imagine in their head, then they equate that and say, well, that must be real. Chi flowing through my body is responsible for those hot flashes I get. It must be chi. I can imagine that that's possible. So then it must be possible. So obviously not very matured cognitive thinking or critical thinking, but a lot of argumentations at that level. What can be imagined? And that level isn't necessarily all bad, because it is hypothesis creation. It's drawing free associations to see if maybe things do fit together, create a hypothesis, speculate a bit, and then decide whether we can develop more understanding off that speculation. But to stop at that level and then assert that as real in the world doesn't meet the criteria of being true.
Correct.
You're not making truthful statements. The next thing, and this is rampant in formal philosophy and academia, is we now have a hypothesis. Can we argue for its internal consistency, for its possibility? Is it possible? So we've gone from is it imaginable? So now is it possible? And if it's possible, we have internal, we have all the logic lines up, all the grammar is available, it's there. If it's possible, then it must be real. Okay. So now you've filtered out the impossibility out of your imagination, and then you rest on the possible, and then you build a strong argument for it being possible, therefore it must be real. That too doesn't meet the criteria of truth, predominantly because it's an argument based on the ideal circumstance, not the real circumstance. And what makes that allowable is not having all of those causal connections, that operational explanation in place. So if you don't have the operational, you can say A equals A here, B equals B here, these two together equals C, so what's a good example? Liberty is good. Free market capitalism is good because it capitalizes on liberty. Therefore, libertarian capitalism results in the best societies available. Well, that's an ideal circumstance that ignores the limits of liberty, which if there's too much liberty, we wander off into predation and parasitism. That's why we need sovereignty, to keep liberty within cooperative bounds. Then we have capitalism, which is all a cooperative system, which is very good, but it's also very conducive to parasitism. So where does parasitism come up, right? So it ignores all of those limitations, it ignores the nuances, and then asserts a claim that this is possible, it must be real, and it's arguing it off ideal circumstances. The ideal circumstances is usually a moral preference underneath it, and that's why I say at that level, really what they're doing is they're arguing for moral presupposition or an ideal preference of some sort. What we want to be at is real all the time, right? We want to be sure that we're what we're apprehending and what we're arguing for, and our understanding of the information we're taking from the world is actionable. And if it is actionable, we have to make sure it's real, that it exists. It's not some ideal circumstance, and it's not just something that I imagine and wish to be true. We have to drill all the way back down into reality, back into reality. Okay. So it's not enough to just ground something back into an observation. You have to ground it back into the causal connections that are responsible for the observation. Okay. So I covered that off, I think, now. Okay.
Sounds good.
Optimal, okay. Redeemable, okay. Okay, I'll put that one aside. And I covered this. I think I covered off most of the stuff that I wanted to cover. Oh no, there's one more. The notion of positive and negative identity. So, for instance, this is more on the coherent side and higher order things. When we define things, we limit them, right? We limit it to within their boundaries. So we can say, let's say, charity, or working for a charity, or working for a soup kitchen is good. And when we do that, when we define the good that way, we're limiting off any other possible good. So then what we have to do is we have to keep adding on. Working at a soup kitchen's good. Helping old ladies cross the street is good. And we, in this ad hoc, keep adding on to the definition of what is the good. When we're probably better off to say anything that's not bad is good. Right?
And then you define what's not bad. Or what's bad.
Yeah. So, and this is critical in what I was saying about sheepdog democracy, is that everybody is built slightly differently. We all have different predilections, different personality traits. Those personality traits inform our preferences, which define our values. Those values then define the good, which means for every different person on the planet, they have a different concept of what the good is. The good for one person might be an apartment in a high rise in a downtown metropolis and $200,000 a year as a job, or it could be a cabin in the woods 50 miles away from anybody. It's your own definition of the good. And when we start defining what is good, we start limiting personal expression of the good. Okay, does this sound kind of like the anti-Trump campaign? If you don't hold our values, you're evil, you're bad.
You're either with us or you're with the terrorists.
That's right. So if you don't hold our concept of the good, then you must be bad. And so when we define something like the good through positive means, positiva, we limit off and restrict any other possible expression of good that we might not know of yet, that we might not have encountered. So by defining the good by saying it's anything that's not bad, we allow ourselves the full spectrum of possible goods.
Correct.
Okay. And for the most part, nobody can agree on what's the good. We see that in our politics every day, and everybody has different personal goals. But for the most part, we can all agree on what's bad. Like, don't rape people, don't murder them, don't steal their shit, right? Don't trespass. We can agree on
don't diddle kids.
Yeah, we know what not to.
And here's the thing that substantiates that is whenever you do something that's bad, your subconscious tells you, and even a psychopath that doesn't have empathy and all of these things, they don't have emotions to experience it, they still know that their behavior is bad.
Mm-hmm. We just don't have the amygdala to have any sensation around it.
Right.
And we can learn and adapt to new bads as they arise. Like, I'm sure 200 years ago, nobody ever would have thought of debt slavery as a bad thing. They would have saw it as charity, loans or whatever, or 500 years ago.
Someone says, not saying there's nothing of value in Judaism or Gnosticism, but pointing out that it's odd for someone deconstructing a general Zio-satanic cult to use symbols that can be misconstrued. Anyway, maybe that's out of context here, but anyway, people in the chat, please keep it on topic.
So as far as I can make it out, the bad is an imposition on the agency of another person. So now I have a spectrum of agency. Other people define agency as, go ahead.
With limitations, with caveats to that statement, because if you are rounding up a pedophile or a rapist or a murderer, etc., then limiting their freedom and their sovereignty is exactly what you're set out to do.
So that's called a tit for tat strategy. If you impose, then we impose on you.
Right.
And in terms of survival strategies, and when they look at survival strategies that are successful, it's called tit for tat. Even in game theory, I think they call it that. Because they have their strategies that are humanitarian. There are strategies that are always traitorous. There's strategies that are always betraying, and so on. And the tit for tat strategy is successful, and it's predominantly successful because it can change its strategy based on the behavior of the other. So a humanitarian strategy, which is always, always forgive and always give charity and so on, the second most successful, because it encourages cooperation from others.
Are you arguing biblical?
Yeah, but what happens is that those fringe elements that are not always cooperative can always take advantage of them. So they get ground down.
Absolutely. Parasites always take advantage of, for instance, Christian goodwill.
Well, and in parasitism, the possibility of parasitism can't rise unless trust is in place, because its operation is a betrayal of that trust. So there has to be a cooperative relationship before parasitism can be a factor. So humanitarianism, which is the predominant sort of philosophy being pushed at these protests right now, is that everything should be, charitous. We should let everybody in. We should everybody have a chance. What happens is it leaves it wide open for abuse, and they grind to a halt eventually. So the one that works is tit for tat. If you cooperate with me, I'll cooperate with you. If you're a traitor, I'll kill you. If you're a betrayer, I'll betray you. If you're a humanitarian, I possibly may betray you, or I may cooperate with you, or I may kill you. So it's a moving strategy based on the interactions with others. And it seems like humans survive off a tit for tat strategy, that we modify our strategy based on who we're dealing with. And then specifically, we modify.
You diddle my kid, I blow your head off with a shotgun.
Yeah. Or if you're not part of my in-group, I'm not going to be humanitarian to you. So we have this moving strategy based on trait preference. So what I was getting down to with positiva and negativa, that if we instead of define the good and what our goals are, which is always ideals, we're moving towards an ideal with that. It's progressive thinking. If we define the what nots to do, define the bads, and build our rules around that. So it's about identifying the limit and then imposing the limit, as opposed to asserting an identity that we haven't defined limits on, and then try to achieve that. And so, like I said, I broke that down as best I can to always having a reciprocal relationship in terms of expended agency. Now, I'm borrowing that almost exactly the wording from Kurt Doolittle, but he breaks that down to property. He says that property is at the source of all of these human interactions, and then he extends the definition of property into intangibles like family or social commons and so on. And I don't see it that way. I see that property is an extension of agency. And when we're protecting property, what it really is a second order example of our survival instinct. Our survival instinct is to protect our life. Our life is really our ability to move through the world, to seek opportunities, which is agency. So protection of agency is our survival instinct. Property then being something that extends our agency, we then protect as part of that survival instinct. So that foundation then, that moral consistency, comes from, is there reciprocity? Are you imposing costs on other people? Or are you fulfilling a reciprocal relationship? Okay. So
somebody, Kate mentioned agency. Is that really one I in himself? Man constantly changes in himself. Simply verify by observation this is true. If this is the situation, then what laws are really needed?
Well, what laws are, the reason why we have laws is because human conflict will still come up because we have different conceptions of the good. So our conceptions bump up against each other. And in that circumstance, you can have both people that have well-argued preferences as to why they're right to justify the conflict. So what we need to understand is, what is the mechanism that leads to those conflicts? Put rules in place and then ensure those rules so that people can seek the good without screwing around with anybody else's ability to seek the good. That way we reduce human conflict. We can all pursue those goods. And as a result, we have more goods. We have more good, more flourishing in our society. So so this notion that if like Rousseau, that we're all a blank slate and it's somehow the state or society that makes us bad, or if everybody just understood or had a clear heart, or Passio had his thing, if anybody had moral reasoning or whatever, then we wouldn't have any need for rules because nobody would ever be in conflict. And that's bullshit. That's essentially just saying, if everybody was me and agreed with me, then we would never have an issue, right? And essentially what you're saying to the rest of the world is, you can't be anything but what I conceive as good.
Right.
Right?
Whereas if we focus on what is bad, then it allows the freedom for whomever to explore what is good.
Right.
Now, being, don't, I mean, you just run down the commandments, I guess, at that point, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's don't murder, don't kill, don't,
steal, don't go screw your, neighbor's wife, etc.
Yeah.
Anything that screws up the harmony and operation of the society.
Yeah, and when we're saying don't do that, what we're really saying is don't enter into activities that encourage retaliation.
Correct.
Right? And then what causes people to want to retaliate? Well, if they've invested in something, if they care about something and you fuck with it, they'll tend to want to fight you for it, right? They'll tend to want to retaliate. So it's really don't step on anybody else's toes. But if we define it as don't step on anybody else's toes, people start arguing for why their toes are bigger than what they really are. So when you step 10 feet away from them, they go, oh, you're on my toe, right? Which is what we have with the classical liberal.
You hurt my feelings, therefore you're stepping on my toe.
Right. So we need a very clear operational definition of what causes those conflicts. Then when we've done that, what we've done is we've defined limits, and then anything within limits is an identity. So we can identify the good as any expression of personal agency that doesn't step outside of these bounds, that doesn't go into predation, doesn't go into parasitism, and
with that caveat is essential.
Yeah, and then what happens and how we preserve that is if you do that, then we will use the monopoly on force against you. And then that becomes the social contract.
All right, so years ago, Peter McWilliams, he was an activist out in the LA area, wrote a book called Ain't Nobody's Business If You Do. And in there he argues essentially, and I'd have to go back through, it's been 15, 20 years since I read the book, but basically the premise that I recall from that long ago is that, and I think you and I had discussed this before, but my freedom ends where your nose begins.
Right. So that's very close to the concept that I'm talking about. The issue is, where does your nose end? Right?
And then you see people playing Pinocchio, right?
Yeah. Yeah, because right now a lot of the arguments on the left is that the social condition in which somebody grows up is part of their nose, right? And there is something to that social conditions are important. But what happens is we don't have a well-defined limit, so we can start reframing the identity of these things. So that's the importance
within
of limit.
Terms of parasitism and
right. So parasites will come in, start reframing the concepts. When they reframe the concepts to their advantage, so that they can use your values against you.
And we see this actually going on a lot right now.
But I would swear to God, all of our statute laws, all of our legislation is an example of that. is a continuous growing nose. That I'm quoting Dan Carlin when I say the growing nose, by the way. So that notion that your freedom ends with my nose, but then people start claiming their nose is bigger than what it is, right? And then the need for, then the need for commensurability around these rules. Then what happens is, in an urban setting, somebody builds a deck and then covers it over, and it blocks the sunlight for their neighbor's garden, and goes, okay, now your activity, your freedom is now bumping up onto the freedom of somebody else, and that needs to be resolved. So then they might pass a law in that town to say, well, the deck covering can only be 8 feet tall. You can't go up 15, 16, 20 feet. It can only be 8 feet tall. Okay. Then you go to the outskirts of town where everybody lives on 25-acre plots, and they can't build a covered deck over 8 feet tall. Right?
Right.
So
when it has no impact on the nose of the neighbor.
Right.
So then you have to say, if your property is within these limits, then you can only have something 8 feet.
So now we've added on. So this is what I mean by that. When we define these things by the good, we keep adding on ad hoc.
Right.
We get this huge leviathan of laws that is a continuous imposition on the agency of its polis. And then what that does is suppress agency within the polis, which suppresses the growth of wealth within that polis, which reduces the likelihood of more agency in the future. And the society just grinds to a halt. So the brilliance of the Western systems, by inverting and putting the individual above the collective, or that the state, especially the legal system, was there to protect the individuals. By protecting individual freedom, what it did is allowed for a circumstance to incrementally increase the agency of the polis, right? And this happens until we bump into the welfare state. Then we hit the welfare state, and then it's a slow suppression of individual agency. And when you suppress the agency of the individuals, you suppress the net agency of the whole society, right? And then there's all these knock-on effects. Only those that are that much more capable succeed. So then you see a faster, more rapid gravitation of wealth or power into a smaller and smaller number of hands, right?
Right.
So at the root of all of this is human agency, and the limits that which we're willing to protect that and encourage it. Because it's not just a matter of letting you do whatever you want. If we only become active agents out of certain conditions. We have to be raised in a family. That family has to be speaking a language for us to learn language. We have to be around walking, talking people to learn how to walk and talk. We grow into active agents. We're not born this way. If we don't have an enriched environment, we are literally no different than the animals. We will be on all fours. We'll be grunting and pissing on ourselves, and we really wouldn't be any different than any other animal that we see in the bush. The reason why we are the way we are is because we have a collective intelligence that we keep passing down that keeps enriching the environment that we're in, that increases the agency of the people within it. That's what we do. We accumulate and produce agency. And where we go to blows is when you fuck with the product of my agency. So that's what it all boils down to. This is reals. This is an operational explanation as to why people go to battle, why people go into conflict. It's not a moral position. I'm not saying agency is morally right. It's not morally right. It's morally neutral, because some jerk can use his agency to screw around with kids. It's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is this is how we grow agency within the polis, and by accepting those limits, we can constrain the development of agency into detrimental expressions. Right? So the moral consistency that I'm talking about is that reciprocity there? What's going on in terms of the tally, the bookkeeping of repayment for people's efforts and their property? Property is a massive part of agency.
So now, if you eliminated, parasitism, what happens to certain societies that are solely based on parasitism?
Well, here's the thing: is that I think that we moved out of the last vestiges of potential predation when we moved into constitutional monarchies. So now we had institutions in place. So we went from ability into social agreement and then into an institution, which is just to say that we agree to ensure the agreement. Our institutions changed and we broke out of the Malthusian trap. And that just means the Malthusian trap is before it was the 1600s. Anytime the population grew, it would grow beyond local carrying capacity, and then people would die. So you'd have an innovation, and it would help the population grow, and then there wouldn't be enough food for them, so half of them would starve and die, or there would be a disease that would pop up. So there was this Malthusian trap that we could never break out of. Our institutions changed, and we essentially got rid of the last vestiges of overt predation and created a system perfect for parasites, which was democracy. Democracy has some serious flaws, and I know it's sacrilege to say that, but democracy is a core part of our problem right now. And then with the free market and the transactions, what happens is we take our agency, we create a property. So if you're creative, you create a property. Somebody else or yourself, you then have to maintain that property, or you can transfer that property to somebody else, and then to fulfill reciprocity, you're paid for it. Well, if you can manage the transactions, you can extract wealth off of those properties. So the property is an expression of agency. Then when you transfer that, the value of that property goes over here. And if you can be the middleman, you can extract wealth off those transactions, which is, incrementally decreasing the value of that property, right? So we created systems that were perfect for parasites. Parasites aren't stupid. The more productive people are, the more that they can extract from them. So they encourage systems to allow us to be productive, which includes teaching us math and how to read and write. Without the parasites, we wouldn't have that. Warm homes, clean food and water, keep us productive so they can keep extracting wealth, right?
Clean, quote unquote, food and water, right?
Clean food and water, yeah. So, but now what's happened is we've risen in our agency, we've risen in our net intellect and our net ability, and then with our education, that we're bumping up against the bottom of these elites now. And we're saying, you're imposing on our agency, and we want change. The only way to do that is to change the institutions again. So if we change the institutions again, generally when you change the institutions, or when there's a need for a change in institutions, is when there's a complete collapse. Very seldom is there a smooth transition for a massive change in institutions. The institution that we need to change is on professional and public speech. Because parasites need to manipulate your awareness of their parasitic behavior, so that they can extract from you under the cooperative or trustful conditions that you're assuming to be in place. So trust has to be present. They have to be able to manipulate information out of those two. And this is even a parasite that lives in your gut. A tapeworm's the same way. A tapeworm can't be causing pain. If it's causing pain, you will seek remedy. So parasites are subtle enough as to not alert your system too much, right? But at the same time, they can't forcefully enter your body. They come in through the food you eat or something that you touch, right? Parasites in our system are no different. It has to be a cooperative circumstance for their opportunity to parasite to be there. And then once they're there, they can't push the parasitism to such a degree that you will change from cooperation to boycott, that you will refuse to deal with them anymore. They can't alert you to such a degree that you end the relationship, or you retaliate and kill them, right? And that's the situation that we're in right now. They've closed all the doors for retaliation through the institutions. They've been manipulating information as far back as the 1700s to be able to extract wealth, right? So we're due for an institutional change. How is that going to come about? Is it going to be revolution? Is it going to be a massive decay in social commons? because a massive immigration will do that. We'll have a rapid devolution of social commons that results in low trust circumstances. And within 2 or 3 generations, we'll get back to a third world country here. So is it going to be that? What are you going to do about it? Right? If you know how this operates and what's going on, what can we do about it? Well, one of the strongest institutions that keeps societies together is the social commons, our social norms, right? And we've outsourced our social norms to the state, right? We look to the state,
the academics, right?
Yeah, to execute on our social norms. Where 1910, Wilfrid Laurier was talking about migration to Canada because that was a big upswing of migration, and he's talking about equality and all the things that we talk about now. But he says that when you migrate here, you are expected to hold our civic values in common. You are expected to be a Canadian. You can be a Catholic Canadian. You can be a Ukrainian Canadian, but you still must be a Canadian. Well, there was nothing in our law that stated that was the case. There was no institution to ensure that. What kept assimilation as a social norm up until around the 60s and 70s was the social behavior of people. That if you weren't assimilating, you would be discriminated against. If you weren't acting Canadian,
and now they
you would be shunned.
Now they block shunning and
Right. So now we have this ideal definition of moral behavior that actually had a social function before, which was making sure that people are operating within a tolerable envelope of difference. They've blown those limits off. So we dump everybody in, and I don't care where they come from. If you have enough people coming in from different cultures, they will atomize. Out of that atomization, there will be alienation. And out of that alienation, there's a reduced trust. So in any of those circumstances, it killed Cyrus Ream. It was an issue in Rome. It's the social norms that we had before made up for what wasn't institutionalized in our governments. That's what I think people don't get is, so we'll say, well, it was racial homogeneity. Well, it wasn't racial homogeneity. It was cultural values that were prevalent and were enforced. It was a cultural commons that we were protecting.
And then we had wonderful Terence McKenna come along and say, culture's bad, kill culture, right. And then every idiot jumped on board with that.
Yeah, and then now, like, this is the whole thing, is that whole rise coming out of Adorno and Horkheimer, which I think for the most part their observations were correct, but they laid the foundation for these notions of massive transformation of Western civilization. That was the goal. The Western civilization had burned religion, had burned objective truth, and then it ultimately was only an expression of oppression. It must be changed. It must be changed at all costs. So you have to understand that all of these people that are moral posturing around us and virtue signaling, at the core of what they want to do is societal devolution. Correct. They want to destroy society as it is so that they can rebuild it. Well, this is how you do it. You take the social norms, you blow the limits off of that. So now that identity is so malleable, you can apply it all over the place. And then while you do that, it loses its social function, its operational, its effect in reality. And its effect in reality was to maintain society, was to maintain social norms that evolved. So if we can understand what keeps society up, which includes having, a monopoly of force, having rules that we can agree on, having a way of enforcing those rules, having a way of coming to remediation, and having social norms that we have a common ground with. We don't have to share them all, but there's a common ground that we must meet and protect. That's what keeps society up. That's what allows us to live together peacefully. If we had an awareness of that social norms, like my grandparents were exceptionally old because my grandfather was born in 1892. So maybe your guys' great-grandparents or your grandparents already had instinctually, by the way that they were raised, We've lost that. And because we've lost that, we're completely defenseless. What I'm saying is that we need to put that back in place. We need to put the social norm back in place. So we have to decide on what are the civic values that work, not that are preferable, not that are imaginable, not that are ideal, but that work. We have to understand how they work, and then we have to stand up for them. We have to work them. We have to work the norms. And at one of the main social norms that we don't have that we need is truthful speech in political and professional life. We have to stop the parasites from lying. If they can't lie, they can't parasite. If they lie, we kill them. No, kill them. We might throw them in jail. But you see what I'm saying?
Well, if they're not living in consistency with, reality.
Right. And the thing is that we're living at the most sophisticated mechanisms of parasitism that have ever existed. We have very complicated ways of lying to ourselves on top of intentional lying. So we need ways of detecting what those lies and those errors and where those biases come up and so on, so that we can prevent the consequences, which is opening the door to parasitic behavior, social erosion, everything else. So that's what I'm saying about operational epistemology, is that this is a means to not only clarify your own thinking and understanding, but it also becomes a means to catch when other people are being intentionally deceitful, they're being self-deceitful, that they're arguing for a bias or a preference, or they're just have made an error. And when we can catch these things, we can correct it. And if we get savvy enough with that, the predators won't have the parasites won't have the doors open to screw around with us anymore.
Absolutely. And then the playing field gets leveled.
Right. So any of the NGOs that we have operating, any of the lobbying groups that we have operating, any of the think tanks we have operating, the majority of our bureaucrats in office, and all of our representatives, to one degree or another, are lying bastards. And they're doing it to push forward their own interests. And sometimes those interests are moral interests. So we say, they're good people, they're doing good work. Well, that's fine, as long as they're not restricting anybody else's ability to do good work. So if they're preventing a conservative voice or a right-wing voice or a libertarian voice, then no, they're imposing a cost upon the informational commons, which we all rely on to act. Therefore, it is a suppression or an attack or a damage to our agency, to our ability to act.
It's like this thing that passed, what was it, this week in England, that they're no longer allowed to watch this arbitrary notion of right-wing YouTube videos.
15 years in jail. It's 15 years in jail. It's the maximum term for watching alt-right YouTube videos.
And no doubt this would be considered an alt-right show just because we don't give out information that the CIA and MI6 would agree with,
Or that we're not in line with a liberal agenda, or that we're criticizing it. So if you're in the UK, you should probably shut the video off.
They're in the UK since you're in Canada.
Yeah. So.
Yeah,
information. This is why I say.
And this is going to create retaliation.
Possibly. This is
unless the British males are so emasculated they do nothing. Which we already know that they are.
Yeah. There's that problem here too. This is why I say this is the sheepdog's tooth. We could talk about arming everybody 16 to 60, and we could talk about a militia that is there to enforce the law. But you got to admit our institutions around that already work pretty well. That's not where we're at threat. Where we're at threat is the lies and the deceit and the reframing and the overloading and the moral posturing that we buy into as true. By what criteria is it true? you know? And do we hold people to that criteria? And what are the consequences when they intentionally fail to meet that criteria? How many marketers would not be able to exist? How many PR companies would not be able to exist? How many politicians would not be elected because they couldn't rely solely on persuasion, but actually had to back up their claims and then follow through on them? This is where we're weak, right? And our academics are not on our side.
No. So
we can't go around appealing to the last writer on logic and say this is what it is. We have to think it through.
Well, academia is set up to exactly for the sole purpose of keeping thought like this out.
Yeah.
And it's, all of the major university systems around the world are controlled by the intelligence community.
Yep.
In my opinion, tenured professors are probably, for the most part, agents.
Yeah, and there's only a handful that are speaking out against
right, and
6 or 7 that are doing that.
Right, and you have this whole. Well, the academic system was put in place by Thomas Henry Huxley for the sole purpose of creating another pyramid structure.
It's manufactured scarcity.
Right, and then you have these academics with their their bullshit peer review system that keeps any alternative or contrary thought out so that they can control the entire narrative.
Yep. Yeah, it's common property information that they built an enclosure around, and then gatekeep who has access to that enclosure.
Yep, exactly.
So that's an assault on sovereignty on a societal level as well as an individual level.
And every time you see a Huxley's name on something, you just label it as a hot piece of sophist crap, and then that it's. I mean, I don't think I've ever found anything associated to the Huxleys that was legitimate. It's all.
Yeah, because there are some academics on that side that I have found value in. I think their conclusions are usually off, but I've never found anything out of Huxley's that are worth anything.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can mine it for the agendas and to understand their tactics and what they're doing, but that's really the limitation of seeking value from it.
Yeah, a lot of lies have to have some truth in them, or you wouldn't believe them.
But it's amazing that you have this entire intelligence community, the CIA, MI6, Canadian Secret Intelligence Service, Australian, etc., that are all based on this complete horseshit of the Huxley family.
Well, and the thing is, we say that we have a social value on truth when every one of our countries have an institution dedicated to not only lying, but keeping an asymmetrical relationship of information, where they have the information and you don't.
Right.
Where they have the truth and the enemy doesn't. So we have a value in truth. No, we have a value on the value of information. So the fact that you have 17, which I think is now 18, intelligence community institutions down in the States shows you how valuable information is. Maybe we should start protecting that.
Right.
Right. Rather than damaging it.
And just getting people to realize that these alphabet agencies are not on our side. Mm-hmm. They're not here to protect our freedoms. This nonsense that they portray in Hollywood of the CIA XYZ agent traveling to a third world country to fight evil. Never mind why they're in a third world country messing with the autonomy of another group in the first place.
Which then encourages retaliation.
Which then encourages retaliation.
And they have to go fly over there to deal with.
Right. But see, that the whole thing is, it's like the Central Intelligence Agency. What they're doing is they're controlling the dialogue, the intelligence of the people here in the country.
Yeah.
So then, by default, this is not an organization that has, or that, is within these, 6 rules of bringing, positive good to the culture.
Right.
When you base everything on Hassani Sabah, Emanuel Swedenborg, John Dee, and Aleister Crowley.
Yeah, but it's high-low versus middle, right? And it's like you kept saying to me when I first brought this up. Why would if they know that this isn't successful in the end, Why would they do it? If a cooperative society that's built on agency is successful, why would you do anything against that?
Well, because it's control, it's rule.
It's a survival strategy. It's a survival strategy of those that can't produce or protect. It's true.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the group that goes around the beach kicking over the sandcastles.
Right.
Know?
So
it's the playground bully.
Yeah, it's the omega mentality within a society that really all they can provide is entertainment or stress relief. That's what omega does. Everybody picks on them to disperse the stress within the community, but he contributes very little to the hunt, and he can't do anything to protect the hunt. He's really just there to make sure that
he's the beta that's hanging out with the women back at the village doing the gardening and the vegetarian stuff, so that he can maybe bang the wives while the men are out on the hunt. You know,
the beta is the enforcer within a pack of dogs. It's the omega that's at the bottom that even the women will pick on. So that's got to say something about cuckmania, is that it's the omegas. They get subsidy for being stress relief within the pack. So they get picked on, they have a terrible time. But what it does is it disperses conflicts, it dissipates conflicts within the pack. And for taking that, they get fed. They get to eat too. They just don't get to eat as much. Well, that survival strategy is, what can I get? What can I get out of the food without producing and without protecting? And then you got to say, well, when they're managing their way through those other members of the pack, they have to monitor when they're going to provoke an attack from them. Well, what did I say about parasites? They have to do it, but not to a degree that it provokes retaliation or provokes boycott. It's an alpha instinct to negotiate through, not provoke, but push limits, and not provoke and push limits. It's this omega role within the pack. So it's a survival strategy, and it's with us because it works. And we need it in some circumstances. We need it when women are raising kids. They need subsidy. They need an egalitarian mentality so that they take care of all the kids rather than just their favorite kid. They need to argue for those subsidies so that they can feed the kids. And they need those subsidies from somebody else, from the male. And they need the community. So that's the whole leftist mentality, is this subsidy-seeking survival strategy.
Well, they sit there bitching and complaining at everything that the society gives them that enables them to even exist in the first place.
That's right, and that's the issue with this leftist mentality. Is what they did is they took what were natural functioning roles within our social systems, and by framing it into oppressor or oppressive, or with Marx framing it into class warfare, what they added in between those roles was resentment. And then by putting resentment in there, it pits everybody against each other. Well, when you pit everybody against each other, they turn from nurturing and an interest in healthy social commons, which is what that omega role does, and turns it into parasitic behavior, where it takes that beta who's there to enforce behavior within the troop on behalf of the alpha and turns them into a predator. It's not just, keeping everybody in line. Now they're going to kill them, right? So it takes the worst of our behavior out when it pits us against each other. What we need to do is get rid of that resentment. So our issue isn't elites. Our issue is that we have the wrong elites. So we shouldn't resent people that are better than us. We shouldn't resent people that rise by ability and by wisdom. We should be glad for them because they produce far fucking more than we do. The issue is that the elites that we've encouraged and produced in our social system are the best at parasitism.
Correct.
Right? And financial predation and stuff like that.
Well, we've built up these usury banking systems that is pure parasitism.
Which is pure parasitism. And wordplay, which is taking, so in some of my posts, I'll talk about de facto agreement, and then social agreement, or I say institution. I use institutionalization differently than you guys. De facto is physical ability. Agreement is social agreement. It occurs because we agree for it to happen. So it's a social norm. And then institution is that we ensure the social norm through force or whatever. What they've done is they've taken that top level, the institution, which is a set of cooperative constant relations that we abstract away from the people that hold them. So you have a general, then we have a major, and then a captain and a lieutenant and a sergeant, and the lieutenant gets killed. Well, the lieutenant, when we say that rank, what we're talking about is a cooperative relationship through that hierarchy. And we abstract the role that that individual plays as a rank, right? So that when Bob, the lieutenant, gets killed, Ed, the sergeant, can step into his role and make sure the cooperative relations maintain. Well, that's the creation of an institution. They're cooperative relationships that survive the particular people that are in them. So it's an intertemporal system of cooperation. Well, they've taken this, which is an innovation that allowed us to grow into new scales that weren't possible before. And by clipping off the fact that it is a social agreement that has people that are operating in it. So an institution only has an effect in the world, right? It doesn't real unless it has an effect in the world. It only has an effect in the world through the people that agree to operate within the cooperative structure. They clip this bottom off, then they treat this institution as though it's people, right? Then that allows the people that step into those roles within the institution to not be accountable for the shit they do.
Correct.
Right?
And this is corporate laws, right? This is giving corporation or an actual physical body.
Yeah.
And then not that every person in the corporation doesn't have a vote, but we're going to give the corporation its own vote. And pretend that this monster, this phantom, is an actual person, or excuse the word person, is an actual man or woman.
Yeah, and then it does two things. So that cooperative relationships are now immortal. They don't die with the people. They only die when the cooperation rests. And we segregate it in our legal system from its mode of action in the world, which is people. So by not holding the people in the organization accountable, the institution can get away with shit forever, right? So when we talk about these institutions that they've created, it's not institutions that's the problem. It's that that institutionalization is being used against us, right? So what I'm getting is that an institution is a result of natural law of cooperative relationships within humans. They're using that natural phenomena against the rest of the population. So that's the degree of understanding that we have to have. We have to be able to look at that and say, we can't get rid of corporations because corporations are the main means that all of us get shit done. Corporations isn't the issue. It's what they've done in the legal system with corporations.
Right. It's taking away personal responsibility.
Right. It pulls it out of reality.
And this is why a lot of people, form corporations, for the sole purpose of avoiding responsibility for their actions.
That's right. Right. So that's what I'm getting at. So now that we can recognize that, we can see what's flawed about a law that is written in such a way that human beings are not accountable for the actions that they take within a corporation. So the corporation isn't the issue. It's a lack of accountability that's attached to the mode of action. How that corporation exists in reality is through the behavior of human beings. So accountability and responsibility has to be at that level of human beings, right? Who cares if you fine an institution? It has no feelings. It has no moral reasoning. It has no effect. You have to find the people that made the decision. Those human beings that made that decision caused an imposition, right? So this operational stuff starts to clarify that degree of nuances throughout and really start to clarify where the work is that we have to do, right? I use your reading vigorously there.
Oh, I'm just, looking at people trolling and not keeping it on topic, and it's like, I don't know how many years we can expose a subject for people to not get it at all and think that certain groups, et cetera, are not involved in this stuff. And it's just, it gets pretty ridiculous.
That's the other thing so what I'm getting at is all of this stuff happens. It's a phenomena that happens within a context. So, we can point at specific groups and organizations and say they're the ones responsible for it, but they're existing within a set of conditions.
Right.
Right.
So what you have to do is
what we need to identify.
Limit those conditions, or eliminate those conditions for them to exist.
Right. And then within those conditions, there's certain phenomena. So one of the phenomena is out of common interest, people will come together to seek certain goals. And they may only come together on one project. They might only be together on that one project. Canada 2020 might be working with CNP in the United States only on this election, because right now their common interests drive that, right? So we have what's happening through the whole phenomena is we have created systems that encourage a certain set of common interests, which are parasitic common interests, and afforded modes of operation to circumvent our institutions to be able to push through those interests. So you have common interests first, then within that you have a coagulation of common interests that come together and operate together. Then you have the solidifying of those, or the institutionalization of those common interests into organizations. I don't care anymore what these organizations are. Yeah, I can draw all the connections from DAPL through investment properties in the States that is essentially an oil cartel that's starting to suppress an up-and-coming new oil cartel that's tied back into political systems that are across party lines in Canada, the UK, and the US. And you know what? Who fucking cares? That's not the issue. The issue is that we have a system that allows that to happen. We have a system that allows institutions that are there to subvert our laws and avoid accountability.
Right. And, and it's, people are so afraid to touch the Zionist issue, but, it is an issue. But what we're seeing is that there is an operational flaw that allows Zionist parasitism to exist, and it's even in the damn Talmud. Don't, commit crimes in your local neighborhood. Go to another city to commit crimes and to steal and do this stuff. It's part of the religion itself, so instead of constantly, and not to say it isn't this group doing this stuff, but we need a solution that totally makes such activity 100% impotent.
That's right. And then further to that, when we can identify what preferences and incentives that they're following, so what survival strategies, reproductive strategies they're following, then we can be able to identify it in other groups, right?
It's funny. I have this book that actually deals with this subject, and you might find this funny. You might know which book I'm going to hold up, but this book actually deals with this parasitic group. It's the adversary throughout this book, and it's been around for, if you believe their chronology, for a couple thousand years.
There you go.
But if you read who is the adversary in every single passage throughout the New Testament, it always identifies one group.
Yeah. And then if we can operationalize that understanding, then we can start building institutions that prevent these problems.
Correct.
Because it's not any one group. It's a certain expression of human behavior and natural phenomena that's allowed to exist. Because the one thing that I'll assert is natural law is never broken. It's just natural law can be used against our better interests, or it can be used for our better interests.
And it's learning how to limit and block anything that's not toward our interests, and holding people accountable.
You have to understand natural law to do that.
And if parasitic groups that do this kind of behavior, once these issues are resolved, they either get with the program or they perish, and that's simple as that.
Yeah. You know, and all of these have a constructive expression, right? So like I was saying, with subsidy seeking and consumptive survival and reproductive strategies, when they're working in alignment with the rest of society, they're the ones that have their eye on the social health. That's what they're interested in. They're interested in the collective. They're the ones to say, you know, let's get out there and build a better park, or let's get out there and help these people. They're the socially minded people. We don't want to get rid of them. We don't want to beat them out. What we want to do is make sure that their tendencies are in alignment with the rest of ours.
Right. They either inculcate or they don't participate.
Right. And then there's the same thing with the conservatives. They're very competitive driven and status driven. Well, they end up being the best of us. They end up being the ones that compete and rise above the rest. We don't want to get rid of them because they are the most productive of us. But we want to make sure that the competition results in the right type of leader. Right. Correct. And then the same thing with the parasites in the middle. The parasites in the middle are all about information manipulation, right? So each of these survival strategies, we can bring into alignment. That's what all of this is about. That when we align our agency together, we have a force multiplier effect that has no limit to its success. It's when we pit it against each other that we have all of these problems. So if we can understand natural law, and then understand when that a libertarian mentality, although is very about preserving agency and opportunity, when turned in on itself becomes a parasitic mindset, or conservatism ends up being a roadblock or predatory mindset, and so on. If we can get all of this stuff in aligned, and we unite across our classes and unite across our differences, we can get rid of a lot of these atrocities and a lot of these impositions that we don't want. Just like we did when we moved from manorialism into constitutional monarchies, where there was a massive increase in human flourishing. We can do that again. And I think that we can do that in a way that it's not just human flourishing, but it's flourishing across the pools of resources that we draw from as well, right? Which is stewardship.
Correct.
Right? Because the only way that you align the three is when there's a greater context that informs the direction that we set. So that, to me, the ultimate role of mankind is stewardship.
Correct.
For the most part, like any other mammal on the planet fits into that role. That if we can get into that context, and I'm not saying that we have to share the same definition or value on what that is, all we have to agree to do is not fuck each other over anymore.
You know, it's like, it's interesting because this is about sheepdogs, but, you know, I don't know if you saw that video that came out recently about the wolves being reintroduced to Yellowstone Park. Yep. And they manage and regulate the entire park. Everything about it is regulated by the wolves. Right
down to erosion within the rivers.
Well, yeah, right down to the direction the river flows, right down to where the trees grow. Yeah. Everything is managed by the wolves.
So I remember 15 years ago giving a lecture on meditation using that scenario, almost identical scenario, to talk about knock-on effects and unpredictable consequences, non-linear systems. The notion that if there is no natural predator, the prey browse back all of the new growth. So grasslands and shrubs take over, which leaves looser soil conditions. So a river meanders and becomes more shallow and spread out, which is not good for the fish, and more sediment in the water. You reintroduce wolves that call back and chase the predators out, so they disperse. So now they're dispersed and they're not in proximity to each other.
But food increases, plants increase, everything increases, the number of prey increases.
That's right. So the biodiversity increases because now the trees
number of predators increases.
Yeah, the soil solidifies, so the river stays deep, free-flowing, and clear. So it's good for the fish. And all of this trickles out. Yeah. Right? There's these knock-on effects that are positive for everything around there because the wolf is killing that deer.
Yeah.
Right.
And sorry, vegans, you're never going to convince the wolf or the tiger or the lion to be a vegetarian, no matter how hard you do it, no matter how many fences you want to put up across, wild plains.
As much as they want to virtue signal how much they love animals, the animals that we have in domestication are animals that we live symbiotically with.
And that don't kill us when we put them in.
Yeah, if everybody turned vegan tomorrow, you would be talking about the extinction of these animals.
Absolutely.
You wouldn't talk about them thriving and having a beautiful, wonder life. They have a beautiful and wonderful life because they are behind fences and don't have to deal with predators. They have veterinary medicines to make sure that they're not suffering from worms all the time. They're fed every day, right? The issue isn't that we kill and eat animals. The issue is that we corporatize it and then treat animals like shit while we're raising them.
Correct.
Right? That's not stewardship.
We need to get back to ranchers and not corporate farms.
Right. That's right. And what we can do to encourage that is buy locally.
Right. And it's like they wiped out, how many tens of millions of bison just so that they could import the beef industry. Because the bison was a free food supply for everybody on the damn North American continent.
Yeah, and I think that there was an issue of overpopulation with the bison at that point anyways.
Well,
because the introduction of disease for the natives.
But, what they had done by killing so many of them, and the bison meat was a higher quality beef, but they killed it out so that they could bring in European beef.
That's right. And the town that I grew up in, there was 3 Ukrainian families that sort of founded the area. And they were trying to breed cattle with bison, because if we were talking, central Alberta, it's north. We're not talking about massive amounts of bison. Right. We had a lot of them bison, and the photographs are quite weird. You'll have a short-haired white cow head on a bison body, right, or a squared-off horned head on a long-haired cow body. It was some strange crap came out of their breeding attempts.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think Charles was the only person who donated in today's show. Thanks, Charles, for supporting the show. Thanks for all we do. You have anything else you want to get across today, Bill?
No, I don't think so. I'd like at some point, which will probably be a long time from now, to actually get into this stuff in proper detail like we did.
Sure, but I did. That was my next question. When do you want to do part 2 on epistemology versus having the show we've been discussing about with Clint?
Well, I think I'm still working through this stuff on my own or for myself. It's probably going to be months before I have it under my belt to a point that I can give nuanced explanation of how to do.
Okay, so why don't we, maybe Jacob will be available for next week, and then we'll have you and Clint on the week after that?
Yeah, that sounds fantastic.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. Thanks for all the helpful and on-topic comments in the chat. And thanks, Bill, for the work. Thanks, Joel, out there, for the work. Thanks, everyone. And, we'll see you next time, Bill.
Thank you.
And I guess I have to find the off button. Take care, everyone. Have a good night.